Halakha is dynamic and it's an ongoing conversation, but it's also very slow moving, necessarily so. And it's a process by which the poskim and the rabbinic authorities will interpret our texts, but also bring public policy considerations to bear. So what I see is this kind of top-down and bottom-up approach, whereby the authorities are making decisions, and then on the ground, things are slowly changing. People are starting to do things. People are acquiring learning, which does lead to action. And as the authoritative decision-making continues, it starts to take on board the public policy and what's happening on the ground. It's a dialectic.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. One of the most difficult issues facing modern or centrist Orthodox Jews today is the question of how to increase and encourage the participation of more women in leadership roles, while also working within the halachic parameters that set limits on how extensive those leadership roles are allowed to be. When we add 2,000 years of socialization, where women's leadership was quite rare, along with the reality that advanced Torah education for women is a relatively new phenomenon, we should not be surprised that there is a very real glass ceiling that cannot easily be broken. Joanne Greenaway encourages women to assume leadership positions, both for their own sake and for the betterment of the wider Orthodox world. In her role as the chief executive of the London School of Jewish Studies, one of the United Kingdom's oldest and most venerated Jewish institutions, and as the director of get cases at the London Beit Din, she has simultaneously learned to work within existing institutions while challenging the status quo when necessary. We discussed the necessity of diverse leadership in general and female leadership in particular, and addressed the fact that women are necessarily limited by Jewish law in terms of what roles they're allowed to fill and what titles they're allowed to assume. We also talked about the halachic category of serara, how halachic authorities work in tandem with social realities, the problem of women having their motivations questioned, the need for male allies, and her hopes for the future. Most apparent, however, was her evident optimism, looking at the many opportunities available rather than at the potential limitations, and believing that the future for Jewish women is bright indeed. We'll get to that conversation shortly. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Continue the discussion on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a very high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Joanne Greenaway is the CEO of the London School of Jewish Studies, LSJS, a global center of Jewish education where she is responsible for the training and development of teachers for Jewish schools and communities and running a wide program of rigorous adult learning opportunities. She has a degree in modern and medieval language from Cambridge University and postgraduate studies in law. She practiced for 12 years in international arbitration and public international law at Herbert Smith Freehills, preparing cases and appearing before international tribunals in The Hague and elsewhere, and overseeing the legal knowledge department for the practice. She went on to establish a new role within the London Beit Din, finding new avenues to resolve difficult cases of get refusal, gradually becoming director of get cases at the Beit Din and deputy legal director of the United Synagogue. She also consulted for Educating for Impact, which involved working closely with a number of European Jewish communities and schools to devise their long-term strategies. She is a graduate of the LSJS Susie Bradfield Women's Educational Leadership Program, the inaugural Rabbi Sachs Scholars Program, and is currently completing a 4-year qualification in Jewish law with Or Torah Stone as part of their International Halacha Scholars Program. Joanne Greenaway, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
We're going to be speaking about glass ceilings, a topic which is particularly relevant given what's going on in the United States political scene right now. For the second time of the past 3 presidential elections, it looks like the Democratic nominee for U.S. president is going to be a woman, Kamala Harris. And we're not going to be speaking about politics today. This is not about whether someone likes Kamala Harris or likes Donald Trump. That is not our topic. However, I think that both of us and almost everybody who's listening would agree, and we will talk about halachic issues shortly, but we will agree that inherently there should be no impediment to a woman being president. The question is whether the broad electorate agrees with that. And that might be as good a place as any to start. Do you think, Joe, that the world, the American world, is ready to have a woman president, even if there's no reason that there shouldn't be one? Emotionally, the American electorate may not be ready.
I think it's absolutely fascinating that we're going to find out. Look, it was only 8 years ago that Hillary Clinton ran for office, and we saw what happened there. You know, she was up against Donald Trump, and by all accounts, she had a huge amount going for her. And it was unbelievable to hear the narrative in the media, public discourse that, you know, frankly speaking, maligned her, very often using very sexist tropes, and very often, I think, compared to hugely unfairly. And we saw the typical female characteristics of being misinterpreted, or, when she was strong, she was called aggressive and she was called manipulative, and all of those different things that really demonstrated double standards. So I don't know, honestly speaking, whether we've come far enough to elect a female president. I would love to think it was theoretically possible. I listened this week to something by Julia Gillard, who was the first Australian Prime Minister back in 2010 to 2013. And she's done a huge amount of work really trying to explain what it was like for her as the first woman to hold the highest office. And she says that she was under an enormous burden. She felt extremely badly treated. She said any mistake was, frankly, like existential for her career. And she said that she felt it would be 120 years until there was full equality for women, which, for me, it got me thinking, well, what does that look like in the Orthodox community where we have so many other issues going on? 120 years, I think double perhaps. But she also said something interesting, which was that she sees, or the data that she has from this Global Institute of Women's Leadership that she's involved with, that there's been a retrenchment in attitudes, and that the young are more regressive in their attitudes towards women than the over 60s, which is talking about the male population. And I found that quite disturbing. And
is she speaking about Australia or across the world?
No, across the world. This is a global institute, and she's seeing this kind of progression, which I think rings true, because you've got all these awful influences that are quite toxic, like Andrew Tate, who was arrested, I think, in Romania, but really spread this kind of toxic masculinity that plays into feelings that young men have of being diminished by feminism, or the second wave of feminism, whatever wave we're up to, which is quite troubling. So I think there's some of that, and it's not helped by the kind of populist rhetoric that we get from some of the world leaders out there. But let's see.
I wonder, however, does that mean, from what you're saying, that if we want to have women in positions of leadership, we want them presumably to bring their specific strengths along with them, their strengths as women. And yet I wonder if they're forced to downplay their femininity, as you described for Hillary Clinton. Are they forced to do so in order to show that they can play on a male playing field, which in some ways undermines the specific strengths that women bring to the table?
Right. Look, I think when we get to the stage that women can be authentic as women, and everybody can lead in their own authentic way, that's when we've really succeeded in equity and equality. I think we can't generalize, but there are feminine qualities that are extremely important to bring to bear to leadership that we are lacking, I would say, in Israel right now. And those types of typical characteristics like emotional intelligence, like intuition, like a more consensus-driven style of leadership, whether that's from a man or a woman, but as you say, those things can be more typically from a woman. I think that's crucial. And ultimately, in any kind of sphere, you need a balance, you need representation. So one thing is the highest office, but another is, for example, in a war cabinet, you need a diverse range of skills and abilities in any kind of setting. So one thing is who's holding highest office and can they do so authentically? But another is really that making sure that we have diversity, which is something that has been a big drive, particularly in the UK, across the public sector and elsewhere in the last few years. And I, as running an organization, as a CEO, I'm very, very conscious of having a range of different voices around the table, which is critical, whether it's male or female, whether it's introvert, extrovert, whether it's a creative or a process person or a visionary or someone who brings us back to reality. You need to have diversity. And I think that's really what will be true success, both within politics and within our community.
I want to ask about that issue of regression among younger people and their attitudes towards female leadership or towards women in general. Do you think, from your own experience, that's true in the Jewish world in general and the Orthodox world in particular, or have you not seen it as much in your own experience in the Orthodox world?
One thing that I have seen, which has been worrying, and actually a friend, a co-learner of mine, Yael Jaffe, wrote about this recently, is that there are less women who are taking up high-level learning programs than in the last generation. And it's very sad for those who have really fought to make those opportunities available, that, we saw it in the Stern College situation where not enough women had signed up for the highest level Gemara classes and they were cut and then they were reinstated. But we see it across the board in Midrashot. And I hear in the UK also that many women feel that by learning in the circles that they move in, by learning more than once a week, for example, they're considered a certain type of woman who's not necessarily appropriate for certain types of shidduchim. And, to even be looking so differently at men and women in regard to learning in this generation is really frustrating. But on the other hand, there are opportunities and doors open for women that are beyond the wildest dreams of people who one generation earlier established the highest level learning programs possible for women. And we have incredible women scholars now who I look to as my role models, who've paved the way. So I think we see both. We see some of that, which is feeding into the types of roles that women are now establishing for themselves, and all sorts of incredible opportunities. And we also see young women perhaps taking it for granted, which maybe is just part of the normalization of this journey.
Then what kinds of leadership on the positive side have you seen, and what kind of leadership do we need? Let's start with Israel. Admittedly, you're in the UK right now, but you do visit Israel often. I know you know what's going on over here. Can you talk about some of the women's leadership that you've seen that's been positive within Israel?
I think firstly, what comes to mind is a recent trip that I made to Israel, where we visited many places in the south and elsewhere. And the inspiration particularly from women who have stepped up in the current situation was so incredible to see. Women who, I'm thinking of a visit to Ofakim, where there were women who were the heads of schools, who basically stepped up in a kind of a leadership vacuum, stepped up and took over the running of the city when it was infiltrated. And I also visited Kibbutz Alumim, where there's a mazkira, a woman, Sarah Jane Landsman, who has been overseeing the whole move to Netanya, to hotels, managing the whole kibbutz. But women who are so strong, so resilient. And, of course, I'm not taking anything away from the many, many men who are, fighting for us as we speak and doing all sorts of other things. But it was just very notable to me how many women there are at grassroots level as compared to at the higher levels, the higher echelons of politics at the moment. And I think we see in the Parshiot that we're reading at the moment the different styles of leadership in Israel. It's Rob Brander wrote a piece about this last week, how Moshe is criticized in many ways for in Parshat Chukat for striking the rock and for his style of leadership as not being fit to lead the next generation, to lead the people who were born into freedom, and who had a different type of mentality, and how he had to hand over the reins of leadership to Yehoshua, who had a different style and who was more consensus driven and was going to take the people forward, which I think is really resonant, because, particularly for women, but really for everybody in our generation, we have a different attitude. We're born into postmodern society where we have more an expectation of more autonomy, of not being dictated to. We want to be involved, and in relation to women and education, we have more access to texts, to our tradition, and I think that affects the kind of leadership that we need, and the need for people to be able to be more involved and chart their own destiny.
I think that's definitely true in pointing out things from the Parsha. In fact, the Parsha we just read this past Shabbat, Parshat Pinchas, to me, is emblematic of the idea of getting new types of leadership, because the Rambam, in the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, talks about the transmission of the oral Torah, saying it began with Moshe. The three specific students he mentions are Yehoshua, Elazar, and Pinchas. And those three individuals are all mentioned in this past Parsha as assuming positions of leadership. So I think that idea of having different styles of leadership, the idea that if you have a Moshe Rabbeinu, perhaps even Moshe had Aaron, of course, but if you have a Moshe and an Aaron, perhaps that's all you need. But for most people and most generations, you need to have different people filling different types of roles, and women certainly have to fill that. You mentioned before, Joe, the idea of intuition, a certain type of consensus building that women can bring to the table, which I think is very, very important. Are there any other specific elements of female leadership that you think are crucial that men, again, speaking in stereotypes and generalizations, but generally women may be more naturally adept at doing that men often might not do?
I really don't like to generalize. What I feel very strongly is that women bring a different perspective. And I think often of the time that I spent working at the London Beit Din, where I was really the only substantive female member of staff within the team, working with wonderful group of dayanim, and I really noticed that by being in the room, I was able to bring a perspective that was missing. I was able to represent both people within a couple, but particularly to explain how the woman in the vulnerable position that she found herself, how it felt to her. And by bringing that perspective, I very, very often saw how it changed, it reframed the conversation. It often led to a different outcome in terms of the way the dayanim were able to use the discretion that they had to decide on whether to order a man or compel a man to give a get. And that to me was very telling, because it reinforced the point that I made earlier about the importance of representation. Where you have male-only spaces, you're not representing the community that you're there to serve. And however sensitive a Rav or a Dayan can be, however how much learning they have, you can't put yourself into everybody's shoes. So I think that's a good thing. And I see it also now more and more in communities where there are teams of clergy, having different voices around the table, different skills brought to bear, I think is extremely important. Particularly men dealing with personal matters. For women, I think that, that whole issue with Torah Mishpacha has been totally vindicated by the incredible work that Yoetzot Halacha do. But I think that holds true in so many different arenas.
Let me ask you about that. When you're talking about your work in the Beit Din, you're speaking about your impact and effect on the people around you, being the only woman in that space. I'm wondering about your own experience as the only woman in that space, not your impact on others, but their impact on you, or perhaps the feeling that you had being perhaps the only person in a professional capacity in that room, along with presumably the wife trying to get a get. What was that like for you? Was that a difficult experience to be in an entirely male space, essentially?
Honestly speaking, I found it to be a privilege to be there. For sure, there are times when it's uncomfortable. You're out of your comfort zone. It's definitely easier to work for me in a group of women where there is some kind of different level of understanding. And I love female-only spaces. I get a huge amount of physical, strength from being with my group of women that I learn with, for example, on the halacha program that I'm studying. Huge amount of strength and ideas about how to tackle the challenges that we face together. But I think if you have an opportunity to be in a male-only space, even if it's uncomfortable, and even if you have to laugh off certain things that they say, which, are kind of the equivalent of the male locker room, sometimes just being there, you have a purpose. And this is something that I discuss on the podcast I've just launched with a friend of mine, a close colleague, Keshet Star. We talk about this because she also is very much involved with resolving get cases. And she makes the same point that you have to pick your battles. and know why you're there. And frankly, being made to feel uncomfortable personally is, it is small fry compared to the needs of the people that you're there to represent. But I also think it's natural. It's new. And I understand from the perspective of the men in the room that it's odd. It takes time to normalize. And I think that process is important. Lots of things have changed very quickly. I think we forget, yes, there's a journey to go down, but things have changed very quickly, particularly in the Orthodox world vis-a-vis women. And so I think I understand when there's a discomfort on both sides.
That actually leads to another question, Joe. When you say it takes time to normalize, the question is, what does normalize mean? And I say this as an Orthodox Jew who's within the system. I don't pretend to be outside of it, and I don't want to be outside of it. I also know that normalization, at least on some level, halachically, is by necessity limited by the parameters and requirements of Jewish law. For example, no matter what we try to do, halacha is not going to allow women to be edim. They cannot be witnesses. That's a fact. It's going to be very difficult for a woman to be a member of a Beit Din. There are all sorts of areas where no matter what you want to do, normalization means to nevertheless, and I say this again from someone who's inside, is always going to mean, so to speak, second class. Whether or not women ever become rabbis in the Orthodox world, at least en masse, right now it's quite rare. The only people who are rabbis who are women are generally from the far left corners of Orthodoxy, at least as I understand it. They may disagree with that characterization, but that's how it seems to me. So what does normalization mean to you? And as an Orthodox Jew, how do you deal with the fact that there is that, getting back to our initial topic, glass ceiling, which probably, at least in the near future, can't be broken?
I think you've touched on the Dayan, the witnessing point is really the far end of where this argument goes. And I totally would not want to try and dispute that. I think that's going to be very difficult to ever overcome. And I was very conscious of that when I worked in the Beit Din. I didn't have delusions of grandeur. I hadn't done the decades of learning that my colleagues there had done. So it was never on the cards. But I suppose being a lawyer and being interested in halakha, in an ideal world, that kind of route would be very interesting to me. And for sure, it is not open. I suppose I'm a glass half full person, and I like to see the opportunities that do exist. And I think we've got plenty to do, and plenty of different roles that I think are developing as we speak, either top down or bottom up. And I see so many wonderful women who are charting their own course in the Orthodox world, who are using their own skills and pushing, not always at closed doors, but pushing where doors are a little bit more open. And I think in terms of, for example, women who are starting to give sak, women who are scholars, women who are rabbaniyot bet sefer, working in religious leadership roles within schools, also within hospitals, within universities where they can give pastoral support. There are so many opportunities where women need to bring their talents to bear. And I think by creating all these role models, what we're doing is we're normalizing women in positions of religious leadership, whether they look exactly the same as the roles that men have, inhabited for centuries, or whether they look a little bit different. But I mentioned Yoetzot Halakha. We also have Toenot Rabbaniyot in the rabbinical courts in Israel, who have learned at the very highest levels parts of halakha that most male rabbis don't even touch on. Even Ha'ezer, for example, and they're tested at the highest levels. That particular program is not running anymore, but it's hugely important, and they have a huge impact in the rabbinical courts, and that has been normalized over the last 20 years since Rabbi Riskin set up that program, and it's changed the way cases are decided. So I think that's been normalized. I think more and more women being part of teams of clergy is being normalized. There are individual cases of women who are running their own communities now, who have been appointed from the ground up and very much loved. And so I think it takes time. But what I'm trying to do with my new podcast is to shed light, to spotlight these women, to show people around the world who don't necessarily know them that this is happening and that this is an exciting time to be a Jewish woman. On the one hand, we could say we're Dor HaMidbar, we're the generation of the desert who's in transition, and we can't click our fingers and make things, a totally equal landscape. And I don't think Orthodox Judaism ever will look like that. But I think that we have a lot of opportunity to do a lot of good as female leaders and as women who are representing our community.
And as long as you mentioned the podcast, let me mention that it's called Women's Gallery. It's produced very well, I have to say. I'm very impressed. I'm curious who you got to do that for you, but it's a very impressive podcast. You're an excellent host and you have some wonderful guests. So I highly recommend that people listening to this also check out Women's Gallery with Jo Greenaway. So 100% honest plug over there. It's a very, very good podcast.
Well, I second the plug for the production.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Moving forward, though, I still want to ask you about that question when it comes to leadership and the inability, let's say right now, to be, for example, a rabbi. For example, Joe, you recently had a ceremony as you completed a certain segment of learning with Midrashet London Beit Din. You're getting a certification in halacha. And to me, despite the fact, again, that this is the system and I accept it, it seems to me hard to accept that two people learning the exact same material, one will become rabbi and one will get something else, and that something else almost inevitably will not be considered in the regular Orthodox community to be the same thing as a rabbi. As if somebody were to study medicine and at the end to get, even despite having the exact same education as a doctor, to be told, yes, but you cannot get more than a nursing degree, even though you have the same education as a doctor. Does that bother you? I know you said you're a glass half full person. At the same time, that ceiling has to be difficult to deal with at times.
It is very personal to me, and I've lost count of the number of people who've said to me, this program that you're learning with sounds really interesting, but what do you get at the end of it? And I struggle with that question, because really we get learning at the end of it, and then it's what we make of it. And in a way, it's very frustrating, but it's also exciting because it's a landscape that's changing as we are changing it. But what I really recognize is that halacha is dynamic and it's an ongoing conversation, but it's also very slow moving, necessarily so. And it's a process by which the poskim and the rabbinic authorities will interpret our texts, but also bring public policy considerations to bear. So what I see is so apparent, particularly in this area, is this kind of top-down and bottom-up approach, whereby the authorities are making decisions, and then on the ground, things are slowly changing. People are starting to do things. People are acquiring learning, which does lead to action. And as the interpretative, authoritative decision-making continues, it starts to take on board the public policy and what's happening on the ground. It's a dialectic. And so I think that slowly, I think it changes. And I see it as a kind of adaptive leadership challenge, whereby I understand that the orthodoxy is consensual, it's global, and that the rabbis, can only change things so quickly before they lose part of their gehillah. And I think it's a very, very difficult task that they have. It's a holy task, and one that they must and they do take seriously. But you lose people if you move too fast. You also lose people if you move too slow. And I do feel the pain on behalf of many, many women who feel like it can't be that we won't see enough development in our generation, but we also pave the way for the people who come after us. And I have teenage daughters, and I want to see a community for them that they feel part of, and I want to see role models for them that they can really aspire to. And I see many friends whose daughters are losing interest because they don't have that, and that really, really hurts. So I think it's up to us to do what we can to create these role models. But I do accept that things have been as they are for thousands of years. Women's learning is a new thing. I just read a wonderful book by Professor Rachel Elior, called The Unknown Women of Jewish History, where she charts the entire Jewish history and the entire women's educational development throughout history. And it really becomes apparent that it's only in the last, say, 100 years that women have been literate, even in the Western world, and still today in the non-Western world, they're not. And so women's exclusion from the Bet Midrash for the last 2,000 years can be seen in a broader perspective. But I think we have to see how far we have come and how much further there is to go.
Let me ask one more question on that same topic, because this is something which I've asked before to other guests on this podcast, and I don't have an answer. I don't know if this is a good idea or a terrible idea. Sometimes I wonder if perhaps we're going in the wrong direction. What I mean by that is maybe the thing to do is, instead of trying to take exclusively male spaces and bring women into them, even though I think we should. I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but because of that halachic glass ceiling, so to speak, where women cannot be eidim, for example, they're not going to be members of the Beit Din, given that perhaps what we should be doing, I'm throwing this out as a possibility, not as a recommendation, is creating new forms of leadership that we haven't yet imagined that will be an exclusively women's space, or perhaps for both genders, but not to try to put women into a space which has been male for thousands of years, and therefore there's both halachic and social resistance. Instead, try to think outside the box, create new forms of leadership that have not yet been considered. And as a result of that, these spaces will be genuinely women's spaces, which will utilize the specific talents that women bring to the table without the problems that come with trying to push halacha in a direction that the Orthodox community may not be willing to let it go. What do you think of that?
So firstly, when you talk about halacha and what is and isn't accepted, just to frame that conversation, we have this concept of serara, of authority, and that comes from shoftim, where we're told, appoint a king for yourself, and then Sifrei say melech velo malka, right? It should be a king and not a queen. And then the Rambam very famously interprets that as pertaining to all types of authority, not just the monarchy. So that, for many hundreds of years, has then become embedded in our culture, I think for reasons of modesty as well. It wasn't seen as appropriate for women to stand out. And also the lack of women's education didn't allow it. But by the same token, we've always had prophetesses. We have 7 prophetesses. We had Devorah, of course. We also had Esther. We had Ruria. There have been individuals who have stood out. Often the rabbis explain that they were accepted. They were accepted by the people, right? They didn't appoint themselves. But I don't think it's as black and white as people sometimes think, in terms of it being a blanket exclusion. Not everyone agrees with the Rambam. There are many different ways that people are interpreting that today. And I think we've seen, even in the UK community, for example, for a long time, women weren't able to be on members of shuls. Then they weren't able to be chairs of shuls. Then that was accepted because it was seen that they weren't the melech, like they weren't the ultimate authority. Then even within the United Synagogue, which is the umbrella body that we have in the UK for Orthodox shuls, a woman wasn't able to be the president of that body. That has now changed as well. So these things are constantly being redefined and reinterpreted in line with societal changes. So that being the backdrop, you asked about new forms of leadership. So I agree and I don't agree, in that I think that women shouldn't be constrained by the way that men have done things in the past. And I think that's very freeing. And one of the things I'm really trying to do on my podcast is try and showcase women who are using their own talents, finding their own roles, whether that's in an educational capacity. Like, myself, I'm running an education organization. It had never been run by women, and it's 170 years of history, but there was no barrier to that. There was no halachic reason for that. And it's wonderful. So I think that there are lots of different ways that women can lead. But when you say men have inhabited lots of different roles, so I wouldn't like to think that none of those things could be done by women. For example, just to go straight to the point, male rabbis, if you break down, as one of my teachers once did for me, you break down all the different parts of a job description for a rabbi. It's quite fascinating. I recommend it. If you break it all down and you think, well, how many of these does one actually need smicha for? And that's even putting to one side the question of what is original smicha, what is that smicha today, the same as what smicha was in the time of the Sanhedrin. Even putting that aside, if you think about the job description, there's education, there's giving divrei Torah, there's pastoral support, there's running programs. There are so many different aspects of that role. The one thing that I think people assume of a Rav is being a shaliach tzibur or laning or running the services and the tefillah. And actually, in the minyan that I belong to, for example, that's done by lay people. It's not done by a Rav. So I think there are many different ways in which roles within communities can be fulfilled, and that can be by a team. And many of those aspects can be for a woman, increasingly so.
It's actually interesting. I've been reading a new book that was put out the past few months called Faith and History by Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz. And in there, at the very beginning, the very first essay is about his criticism of non-Orthodox forms of tefillah, what he calls temple Judaism. Temple not as in the Beit HaMikdash, but the modern temple, and how it's a regression to something that was pre-synagogue, to the Beit HaMikdash at a time when that was appropriate for an era now that it's not appropriate. And one of the issues he describes there is how the clergy in non-Orthodox synagogues has a much stronger role. They're almost like the Kohanim. They have a specific role, and in an Orthodox rule, that's just not the case. The rabbi, he says, he's someone who might represent the ultimate thing that a layman should strive to be. There's nothing magical about his role that's any different from anyone else there. And what you're saying is the same thing. Ultimately, there's nothing inherently about the clergyman's position that makes it forced to be a clergyman per se in most situations.
Right. And it's from a time when people were more passive in their Judaism, which comes back to the point about people wanting to be more engaged and it not being as top down, I think, for the younger generation. We also shouldn't take away from the women's role in the home. I wouldn't like this to come across as if it's, encouraging women to leave behind what's been their traditional critical role in chinuch and in building a home. But more and more I see men, I suppose, emulating social norms and becoming much more involved in home and in the chinuch aspect. And so as that's shared, women and men, according to their own particular talents, are divvying things up in their own ways.
One of the most difficult things that I've seen, coming again from a male perspective, but seeing how some men treat women who are learned. And there's almost, among some, not all, but among some, a basic assumption that they certainly don't know as much as a man does. No matter what, I've seen people who are very well-meaning nevertheless assume that, for example, Yoatot Halacha from Nishmat, and I have tremendous respect for them. I've seen, I can't speak about all of them, but those to whom I've spoken generally know more than men do about Hilchot Nidah. It's just a fact. And there is an assumption among many people that the problem with Yoatzot Halacha is that they don't know as much about Torah in general. Now, that might be true for some, but I also know plenty of rabbis who don't know very much. I compare it almost to the way that in the United States South, back in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, black voters were often forced to take a literacy test, and the white voters had to spell cat, whereas the black voters had to answer questions like, talk about when the War of 1812 broke out and the reasons why. That kind of thing. It's not fair. And we're sometimes doing the same thing to women on some level, saying, well, in order to prove that you actually are genuine, whatever that's supposed to mean, in what you're doing, and that it's not some feminist innovation, whatever that's supposed to mean, you have to go and demonstrate a level of leadership which is beyond that which a man would have to describe or embody. So that brings me to obstacles. So, Joe, can you talk about some of the obstacles that you, now the CEO of LSJS, the London School of Jewish Studies, have faced in progressing in leadership?
I don't tend to see obstacles as problems. I see them as challenges to overcome. On the whole, I've felt very supported, but I do hear what you're saying about double standards. And many women experience those kind of double standards, that we constantly have to demonstrate our learning, our place at the table that we've earned. And it's not right. It goes back to the point I made at the beginning by Julia Gillard, that if you put one foot wrong, it can be existential. It's this kind of judgment, which bothers me very much within the Orthodox community generally, that we are too judgmental. I heard a beautiful story given over by Rabbanit Hamutal Shaval last week, the story from Chagiga, from the Gemara in Chagiga, about Rav Idi, who is in Bavel, and he wants to learn with his teacher, who's in the Galil, Rav Yochanan, and he travels for 3 months just to learn for one day, right? He's traveling, he's working as he goes, but he wants so much to learn with this one teacher, and he learns for one day before he has to travel back for 3 months. And what happens when he gets there? So all the Bochurim in the yeshiva laugh at him. And they say, who's this guy? Why is he only learning for one day? What does he know? He looks a bit different. And Rav Yochanan gets really crazy with them and says, how do you know what he's learned? Who are you to judge his learning in his place? How do you know what he's going to do with the learning? Firstly, how his one day of learning affects him, how wise he is already, and what impact he might make with the learning that he has. And that story really struck a chord with me, because it really goes to this point about judgment. Just because we haven't perhaps sat in the Bet Midrash for our whole lives, and we may have come to it later, or we may have taken a different path. We might learn differently, but our learning should be respected, as should anybody's. So those double standards and the judgment exists. Women's motivations are very often questioned as well. If we're looking at equality of opportunities and access to learning in particular, women's motivations are questioned. And I think that ultimately, if your motivations are becoming closer to God, becoming closer to Torah, and having a thirst for knowledge and wanting to serve the Jewish people, then whatever judgments come in your direction, it shouldn't be taken personally. And I try really hard to recognize that if I'm criticized, or if I encounter some kind of reaction which I know is coming from that place, then I have to identify it with fear. That is a fear of a system that's being destabilized and that's changing very fast, and know that it comes from there, and try not to take it too personally. That's not to say that I'm not reflective and I don't recognize when I make mistakes, because that's really important. But I think as women, we can often be too critical of ourselves and feel too much of this imposter syndrome, which ultimately can be paralyzing and really unhelpful.
Then, Jo, let's talk a little bit about differences that you have seen. We spoke before about Israel, but between Israel and the UK, I can say the UK specifically, or the diaspora in general, from your experience. In Israel, on the one hand, we have a very strong chief rabbinate, which is very much involved in politics. 2 weeks ago, I spoke with Rabbi Seth Farber of Etim. So anyone who wants to hear about that can go and listen to that episode. The chief rabbinate is a troubled institution. It is a flawed institution. I'm not going to try and rehash that right now. But given its power in Israel, that means that Israel certainly has a real problem, I'll say it frankly, with misogyny within the existing rabbinate, even in areas where halachically there should be no barrier to women participating. On the other hand, Israel is a new country. We are 70-something years old, and therefore traditions are still being established here, and new patterns are being created in a way that may not be true in a place like the UK, which has a long-established United Synagogue, long-established institutions. The school you're part of itself has been around for, I think, about 170 years. It's not easy to change something that's been around for so long. So can you talk for a few moments about some of the differences between female leadership and how it's progressed in the UK and Israel?
I'd say in the UK, we tend to be around 20 years behind. I'm not sure if that's fair, because we're not comparing like for like, but the UK community does tend to be conservative with a small c. The English are conservative with a small c, so it's not surprising that there are all sorts of structural reasons for that. Rabbi Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, Rabbi Sachs had a huge impact in revitalizing our community and paving the way for a lot of the exciting developments that have happened since. But when it comes to women's involvement, women's leadership, there have been exceptions over the years. I actually love talking about Flora Sassoon, who 100 years ago this year gave a speech at Jews College, which was the predecessor to LSJS that I run now. And she was this remarkable woman who was so learned. And she gave this speech that's historic, where she addressed all the smicha graduates and the academic graduates. And obviously they were all men, but she was very erudite. And she learned with lots of Rebbeim, and she lived in Iraq, and then she moved to different countries. She spoke about 7 languages, but she was incredibly impressive. So there were these isolated instances, but on the whole, women's learning has been later. Actually, there are many women as principals of high schools in the UK, which is something that even my contemporaries in the US are surprised by. I'm talking about co-ed Orthodox high schools. But when it comes to women's scholarship, we are behind. We now have a number of really high-level women's learning programs, which is something I'm really trying to spearhead at LSJS, because it means a lot to me. And I think that lays the ground for so much that comes afterwards. But we still, for example, we struggle to find female Gemara teachers in the UK. There are few, but not many. I think that in Israel, just because there is such a, the critical mass, the diversity, these programs have been running for so many more years. You have these role models from, I don't know about the earlier generation, because they're still very much active, like Rabbanit Devorah Evron, like Malka Puchakovsky, like Michal Tikochinsky, like amazing women, Rachel Levmore, all of these remarkable female scholars that have been role models and that have laid the ground for so many more people to come in their footsteps. And what I see is that has then given this kind of normalization, which we're not up to yet in the diaspora, particularly not in the UK and around Europe. This normalization where it's not a threat anymore. Women call themselves rabbanit. There are many, many women who take that title in Israel. It's not the case in the diaspora, apart from for people who are married to a rabbi. So at grassroots level, obviously in contrast to the rabbinical courts, like you mentioned, but at communal level, I see that there are less obstacles because people just get on with it.
Okay. I have two more questions for you, Joe. The first one is about the nafkamina, as they say, practical steps. I want to know what you would like to see moving into the future. What are the realistic goals that you can set for yourself and for women's leadership in general for the coming years?
Oh, such a great question. There are so many things that I'd like to see. We have so much to do. One thing that is really important, and I'm not the only one to remark on this, but women's writing is very much what I see as the next frontier. There have been a couple of great programs established just in the last couple of years through Sefaria, through Matan. The Matan program's called Kitvuni because Queen Esther, in the Talmud, there's this really famous conversation where she argued about the importance of having her book included in the Tanakh. And she was told, no, it's too political and it's not appropriate. And she said, Kitvuni l'dorot, like, I want this story to be written for the generations. And that's true of women today. We learn from Sfarim that are written by all men, and that has an impact. That hits us. It's not that we don't want to do it, but our voices are lacking. And not just from a negative, but from a positive. How much can we bring to the canon? What can the Nashim provide to the future of the Jewish conversation? I think that's incredibly exciting. I'm actually trying to work on a book of my own to put my money where my mouth is at the moment. So watch this space.
What's the book on?
It's about get refusal worldwide in the 21st century. What's being done, what can be done. So yeah, that's please God to continue. But there are many, many other things. One thing I remark on quite frequently is how we don't stand for women with learning. So when a Rav walks into a room, we know to stand up to show him kavod. How impactful would it be if we stood for a woman with learning? It's such an obvious thing, but I think we've not quite, it's not quite clicked that that's important yet. Also, women being at the level at which, or being accepted to teach all male groups. So we have many in school settings, say we have many rabbanim who teach all female classes, but not yet. It's not really accepted, perhaps more for reasons of sniot as well, but it's not yet accepted that women should teach classes of boys in Bet Sefer. I also see that women with learning are sometimes avoiding getting involved in women's issues, which clearly I'm not doing with this podcast, but many women who are writing very scholarly, very halachic responsa, for example, or teaching, prefer to stay away from women's issues because they don't want to be branded as feminist, or they don't want to, or they want to stick with more conservative topics until they have more acceptance. I think it's a kind of picking their battles or not wanting to jeopardize the position that they feel, almost lucky to be in. And I think once we get past that and the positions themselves are normalized, their authority is normalized, they can authentically contribute to the conversation about women's issues where women's perspective is so important. So I think, that's something that we'll see. I mentioned earlier about teams of clergy in communities. Many communities have large teams, and I think it's critical that we see a balance of different voices within those, which we are starting to see. And generally, the networks that we've created as women, I see those as becoming even more important. There's a network in the US at the moment that's looking at the field, the landscape of women's leadership, and really analysing, researching, and looking at how it can be grown. But that's just one example of so many networks that I'm involved with, where women are supporting each other to find ways through the obstacles that they're facing, to support each other, to collaborate on projects in a global way that helps to give us different ideas and inspiration. I hope my podcast will also inspire people to see what can be done. And generally, look, I think I'm not going to be a Diane anytime soon, but I think there are a lot of opportunities out there, and really it's a privilege to be involved in this work.
Let me add one thing, Joe, if it's okay. I think another important goal should be that women who are teachers or women who are scholars and residents should be paid at the same level as rabbis who have the same work. I don't know, except for isolated examples, but I believe that that remains a problem, that the pay difference, perhaps because of the title difference, we go back to that again, but for whatever reason, is not always fair. It's not always that men and women who are brought in for the same type of job are necessarily paid the same. I think at least emotionally as well as practically on the ground, and just in terms of fairness, another aspect of fairness is making sure that women are paid the same money that men are in the realm of Jewish education.
That's for sure. I couldn't agree more. And I should also note that in the field of education, there are women who have been tirelessly teaching our children for generations, who I'm full of admiration for. And I don't think we treat them with the kavod that they deserve, the pay or the kavod. And they're disproportionately teaching Jewish studies. We have disproportionate amounts, certainly in the UK, of women compared to men. And that leadership role should not be underestimated because, frankly, I'm in awe of the work that they do.
Okay. Now, my last question is about male allies. I hope I'm counted among them. I can't promise that I am. That's not for me to decide. But men who want to support women's leadership, being able to move past that glass ceiling, whatever the glass ceiling is and wherever it is, while remaining within the halachic system. Could you say to people like us, what would you like to see us do?
It's a great question. Look, this is not a women's issue. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. Ultimately, a more equal world, a more equal community is better for everybody. I think it's really the way the way forward to Mashiach. I'm not overstating when I say that. It's better for everybody. And I think we all need to come together to create more representation and to recognize all of our talents. This isn't just about women either. This is about women recognizing those talents in men and men recognizing them in women. I've heard the most frustrating things that I've heard when I've talked to people about rabbis is that there aren't enough jobs and women shouldn't get involved in things because it will take away from the men, which is an incredibly frustrating argument, because what I hear then is that this is coming from a place of fear and of self-protection, when we all have to, think bigger and have a vision for the future of our inclusive, welcoming, exciting community that is a community that we all want to be part of for the generation to come.
Okay, well, I wish you tremendous hatzlacha, and I thank you for everything that you're doing. Once again, for people listening, listen to Women's Gallery, an excellent podcast where Joe is the host. Let's hope that we can continue moving things forward, and I very much appreciate your optimism, your glass half full mentality, and let's hope that we can move things in the most positive direction possible and make our Jewish community as good and as strong and as fair as it possibly can be. Joanne Greenaway, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. Please visit jewishcoffeehouse.com for other episodes of the Orthodox Conundrum, as well as many other great podcasts, including Intimate Judaism, The Maimonides Minute, Chochmat Nashim, The Francisca Show, and Let My People Eat. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. I hope you'll become a Jewish Coffee House patron on Patreon. Just click on the link in the description of this podcast, and you can get bonus episodes, Jewish Coffee House merch, and more. You'll get special episodes on all sorts of topics that are only available to subscribers, and you'll be helping Jewish Coffee House spread our message of a welcoming, intellectually engaged, and honest Orthodoxy. Just join Patreon. It's only a couple of dollars a month, and you can stop anytime, so join today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to me at scott@jewishcoffeehouse.com or go to jewishcoffeehouse.com, click on Productions, and sign up for a free consultation. Make your voice heard, promote your cause, sell your product, and engage an audience now. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been The Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com.